They thought someone broke into their home. They were wrong. What they found was already inside, and had been for 61 years. Sarah and Daniel stood on their lawn, watching a shadow move through their living room window. They called 911. Police arrived in 4 minutes. Every door locked, every window latched. Alarm, still armed, no one inside, but on the coffee table, a glass of water, still sweating, freshly poured. They hadn't touched it. The impossible question, if no one broke in, how did someone get inside? Over the next 6 weeks, the cameras would capture it sitting on their couch, walking their hallway, testing their bedroom door at 2 a.m. And when they finally discovered the truth, buried 3 feet below their basement floor, they'd realized the shadow wasn't a stranger. It was the man who'd lived in their house in 1956. The man who never left. The man whose wife made sure of that. This isn't about a haunting. It's about what happens when a murder stays hidden for 60 years, and what comes back when you dig it up. If stories like this unsettle you in the best way, hit that subscribe button. We're just getting started. Sarah and Daniel Brennan were not the kind of people who believed in the unexplainable. She was a grant writer for a nonprofit. He worked in IT security. They'd bought the house on Riverside Drive in early 2015, a modest 2-bedroom craftsman built in 1948, tucked into a neighborhood where families knew each other's dogs by name. The home had been owned by the same elderly woman, Margaret Colby, for 43 years. She died peacefully in hospice in 2014. The estate sale was uneventful. The inspection revealed nothing unusual. The Brennans painted the walls, refinished the floors, and settled into a life that felt exactly as stable as it looked. For 2.5 years, nothing happened. No creaks in the night, no cold spots, no whispers of prior tragedy. The house was just a house. Sarah liked the bay window in the living room. Daniel liked the detached garage where he tinkered with a vintage motorcycle. They hosted book clubs and barbecues. They adopted a cat named Olive. It was the kind of home where you measured happiness in Sunday mornings and the smell of coffee. But small things, imperceptible at the time, had been building. In June of 2017, Sarah mentioned that she kept finding the kitchen faucet dripping, even though Daniel swore he'd tightened it. In August, Daniel noticed the thermostat had been adjusted twice when neither of them had touched it. They blamed each other. They blamed forgetfulness. In September, Olive started sitting in the hallway at night, staring at the attic access panel. Cats do that, they told themselves. Cats are strange. On the evening of October 14th, they'd had an entirely normal Saturday. They'd gone to a farmer's market. They'd made dinner, chicken tacos, Daniel's specialty. Around 9:30 p.m., Sarah realized they'd forgotten to check the mail. The mailbox was at the street, maybe 80 feet from the front door. Daniel grabbed his keys. Sarah followed. They left the lights on, the TV playing a rerun of a cooking show, the front door locked behind them. The air was cool and damp, typical for Portland in October. They walked slowly, talking about plans for the following weekend. Daniel opened the mailbox, pulled out a stack of junk mail and a water bill. That's when Sarah glanced back at the house and froze. Through the sheer curtains of the living room window, a figure moved from left to right. It was there for less than 2 seconds. A shadow, human height, crossing behind the couch. Her breath caught. She grabbed Daniel's arm. "Did you see that?" He turned. Saw nothing. Then, movement again. Slower this time. Deliberate. Someone inside their home. Daniel's first thought was logical. Break in. But the front door was closed. No cars in the driveway. No broken windows. Sarah pulled out her phone and dialed 911, her voice shaking but controlled. "There's someone in our house." The dispatcher kept her on the line. Daniel stood between Sarah and the front door, keys clenched in his fist, watching the window. The shadow didn't reappear. 2 patrol cars arrived within minutes, lights cutting through the dark. Officers approached the house with flashlights drawn. They knocked, announced themselves, tried the door, still locked. Daniel handed over his keys. The lead officer, a calm woman named Rodriguez, unlocked the door and stepped inside. The alarm beeped its 30-second warning. Daniel provided the code. The system showed, armed, no breaches. Rodriguez and her partner cleared the house room by room, closets, bathrooms, the attic, the basement. Nothing. No one. But in the living room, they noticed what the Brennans would later confirm. The remote control had been moved from the coffee table to the arm of the couch. A couch cushion, previously flat, now bore a faint depression. And on the coffee table, a glass of water, beads of condensation, still fresh. Sarah stared at it. "We didn't pour that." Rodriguez looked at Daniel. "You're sure?" He nodded. The officer took photos, filed a report, told them to call if anything else happened. But her face, Sarah would later recall, carried something unspoken. Not disbelief, unease. The Brennans didn't sleep that night. The next morning, Daniel changed the locks. He installed a video doorbell. He checked every window latch twice. Sarah researched home security systems and ordered motion sensor cameras for the living room and hallway. They told themselves it was a fluke, a trick of light, a neighbor playing a prank, some explanation they'd eventually find. But the glass of water haunted them. It had been room temperature, not cold from the tap, as if someone had poured it, then waited. For 3 days, nothing happened. The cameras recorded only Olive wandering through frame. The new locks felt solid. Daniel went to work. Sarah worked from home, as she often did, but now she kept her phone within reach. She avoided the living room. On October 18th, 4 days after the incident, she was in the kitchen making lunch when she heard a sound from upstairs. A soft, rhythmic creak, like someone shifting weight on the floorboards. Olive was beside her. The house was supposed to be empty. Sarah grabbed a kitchen knife and climbed the stairs, heart hammering. The bedroom door was open. The room was empty, but the closet door, which she'd left closed, stood halfway ajar. She checked the camera footage later. The hallway camera had captured nothing. No movement. No one entering the bedroom. But the audio had picked up the creaking, clear and deliberate. She called Daniel. He came home early. They reviewed the footage together, and Daniel noticed something odd. The creaking lasted exactly 12 seconds. Then silence. Then the closet door appeared open on the next frame, as if someone had walked across the room, opened the door, and vanished. "Old houses settle," Daniel said. But he didn't sound convinced. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening. At 2:17 a.m., she heard footsteps in the hallway. Not loud, not threatening, just the soft pad of bare feet on hardwood. She elbowed Daniel awake. He heard them too. They waited, frozen. The footsteps stopped outside their bedroom door. Daniel grabbed his phone, ready to call 911. The door, closed and locked, rattled once, as if someone had tested the handle. Then silence. Daniel threw the door open. The hallway was empty. The camera had recorded nothing. But when Sarah checked the living room camera feed, her stomach turned. At 2:16 a.m., a shadow had moved across the far wall. No source, no explanation, just a shape crossing from the kitchen toward the stairs. 1 minute before the footsteps. The next day, Sarah called a locksmith to install a deadbolt on the bedroom door. The locksmith, an older man named Eugene, asked why. Sarah explained vaguely, "Home security, peace of mind." Eugene nodded, but as he worked, he asked casually, "You know the history of this place?" Sarah blinked. "The previous owner died peacefully. Why?" Eugene tightened a screw. "Not her. Before her. Back in the 50s. Family named Dunn lived here. Father disappeared. Never found. Wife sold the place in 58. Sarah felt cold. "Disappeared how?" Eugene shrugged. Story goes he walked out one night and never came back. Some folks said he ran off. Others weren't so sure. Sarah didn't tell Daniel immediately. She researched instead. County records showed that in 1956, a man named Thomas Dunn had been reported missing. No body, no leads. His wife, Evelyn, stayed in the house for 2 more years, then sold it and moved out of state. Newspaper archives were sparse, but one article from November 1956 mentioned that neighbors had reported disturbances at the Dunn residence, unexplained noises, lights turning on and off. The police investigated but found nothing. The case went cold. Thomas Dunn was declared legally dead in 1963. Sarah sat at her laptop staring at a grainy photo of the house from a 1957 real estate listing. Same bay window, same front door, same walls. That night, the cameras captured something new. At 11:43 p.m., the living room camera showed the couch cushion depress, slowly, deliberately, as if someone had sat down. The motion sensor triggered. The timestamp burned into the corner of the frame. Sarah and Daniel were upstairs, both visible on the bedroom camera. No one was in the living room. The cushion stayed compressed for 90 seconds, then released. The camera recorded every second. They watched the footage together in silence. Daniel rewound it, played it again. "We need to leave," Sarah whispered, but Daniel shook his head. "We just bought this house. We can't..." He stopped. On the screen, the shadow crossed the wall again. This time, it paused and turned toward the camera. Sarah contacted a paranormal investigation team on October 22nd. She'd resisted the idea, still wanted a rational explanation, but the footage was undeniable. The team, a local group called Northwest Phenomena Research, arrived 2 days later. 3 people: a lead investigator named Dr. Lena Ortiz, a tech specialist named Jamie, and a historian named Garrett. They weren't the ghost hunting TV types. Lena had a PhD in psychology. Jamie worked in audio forensics. Garrett specialized in Pacific Northwest history. They took the case seriously. They set up equipment throughout the house: EMF readers, infrared cameras, audio recorders. Garrett interviewed the Brennans, taking notes about every incident. Lena reviewed the camera footage with a clinical eye. "This isn't residual," she said, pointing at the shadow on the screen. "Residual hauntings are like recordings. They repeat. This is responsive. It's aware of you." Sarah felt her skin crawl. "What does that mean?" Lena didn't sugarcoat it. "It means something here is conscious, and it's been here a long time." That night, the team conducted a 12-hour investigation. They recorded EVP sessions, electronic voice phenomena, asking questions into the silence, and analyzing the audio for responses. At 1:34 a.m., Jamie played back a recording from the living room. He'd asked, "Is someone here with us?" On playback, beneath the static, a voice responded. Faint, but distinct. "Still here." The Brennans listened to it 5 times. It wasn't Sarah. Wasn't Daniel. Wasn't any of the investigators. Lena's expression was grave. "We need to dig deeper into the history." Something anchored this. Garrett spent the next 3 days in county archives and library microfiche. He found more than he expected. Thomas Dunn, the missing man from 1956, had been a WBO2 veteran. He'd returned from the Pacific Theater in 1945, married Evelyn in 1947, and bought the house in 1948. Neighbors described him as quiet, sometimes withdrawn. In October 1956, he told his wife he was going for a walk. He never returned. Police searched the neighborhood, dragged a nearby creek, interviewed everyone. Nothing. But Garrett found something the police hadn't. A diary entry from Evelyn Dunn, preserved in a donation to the Oregon Historical Society. Dated November 3rd, 1956, 2 weeks after Thomas disappeared, she wrote, "I hear him at night, walking the halls, sitting in his chair. I know he didn't leave. I know he's still here." Garrett showed the diary to Sarah and Daniel. The entry was chilling, not because it suggested the supernatural, but because it described exactly what they'd been experiencing. Footsteps, the couch, the sense of presence. Evelyn had lived with it for 2 years before fleeing. "Did she ever say what happened to him?" Daniel asked. Garrett shook his head. "She moved to California and never spoke about it publicly. Died in 1984. But," he hesitated, "there's one more thing. In 1957, a plumber was called to the house to fix a pipe issue in the basement. He reported a smell, something foul, organic. By the time investigators checked, the smell was gone. They assumed a dead animal in the walls. Case closed." Sarah felt sick. "You think he's in the house? You think Thomas Dunn never left?" Garrett chose his words carefully. "I think something happened here that was never resolved. And I think whatever's happening now is connected to that." Lena added, "Hauntings like this, intelligent, persistent, they're often tied to trauma or unfinished business. If Thomas died in this house and no one ever found him, his presence might still be tied to the location." That night, the team set up a targeted investigation in the basement. The Brennans stayed upstairs, watching the live feeds. The basement was unfinished. Concrete floor, exposed beams, old furnace. Jamie placed audio recorders near the furnace and along the far wall. At 2:11 a.m., the EMF reader spiked near the southeast corner. Lena asked aloud, "Thomas, are you here?" The temperature dropped 6 degrees in 30 seconds. Then, on the audio recorder, a response. "Can't leave. Not faint this time. Clear. Male. Strained." Sarah covered her mouth. Daniel stood frozen. Lena looked at the camera. "We need to find him." The next morning, Daniel called a structural engineer. If Thomas Dunn had died in the house, accidentally or otherwise, and his body had been concealed, it would likely be in the basement or walls. The engineer, a no-nonsense woman named Dr. Patel, arrived with ground-penetrating radar equipment. She was skeptical of the paranormal angle, but agreed to scan the basement. If there's anything unusual, voids, density changes, we'll find it. The scan took 4 hours. Dr. Patel moved the radar unit methodically across the basement floor. Most of the readings were normal. Soil, concrete, old pipes. But in the southeast corner, near where the EMF spike had occurred, the radar showed an anomaly. A void, roughly 6 feet long and 2 feet wide, buried about 3 feet below the surface. Dr. Patel frowned. "That's not a pipe. It's too uniform. Could be an old septic tank, but..." She looked at Daniel. "You want me to say it could be something else?" He nodded. She sighed. "It could be something else." Daniel obtained permits to excavate. A small crew arrived on October 30th. They broke through the concrete in the southeast corner and began digging. Sarah couldn't watch. She sat upstairs, Olive in her lap, listening to the sound of shovels against earth. At 3:47 p.m., one of the crew members called out. Daniel went down, returned 10 minutes later, face ashen. They found something. Police were called. Detective Morris, a veteran investigator, arrived with a forensic team. They excavated carefully. What they found was a makeshift grave, a shallow burial, wrapped in a deteriorated tarp. Inside, human remains. The forensic team worked through the night. By morning, they had a preliminary ID based on dental records and clothing remnants. Thomas Dunn, dead for 61 years. Cause of death, blunt force trauma to the skull. Homicide. The news hit the Brennans like a shockwave. Not just that Thomas was buried in their basement, but that someone had killed him and hidden him. Detective Morris interviewed them gently. "You didn't know. No one did. But now we need to figure out who." The investigation reopened a case that had been cold for over 6 decades. Evelyn Dunn had died in 1984, so she couldn't be questioned. But Morris pulled old police files and found something troubling. In 1956, neighbors had reported hearing a loud argument at the Dunn house the night before Thomas disappeared. Police had questioned Evelyn. She'd claimed Thomas left after a disagreement, but gave no details. They had no evidence to pursue further. The case stalled. Morris reviewed Evelyn's diary entries again. One passage, dated October the 20th, 1956, the day before Thomas vanished, read, "He won't stop. The drinking. The anger. I told him if he didn't leave, I'd make him." It wasn't proof, but it painted a picture. Morris hypothesized that Evelyn, in self-defense, or in a moment of rage, had killed Thomas, then buried him in the basement, covered the grave with concrete during a later renovation, lived above his body for 2 years, haunted, literally and figuratively, before fleeing. Sarah asked the question that had been gnawing at her. If she killed him, why didn't she just leave? Why stay? Morris had seen cases like this before. Guilt, fear. Maybe she thought she could outlast it. Or maybe... He paused. Maybe she wanted to be close to him. Some people can't let go even after something terrible. With Thomas's remains removed and properly buried, the Brennans waited to see if the haunting would stop. For 2 nights, nothing happened. No footsteps, no shadows. The house felt lighter. But on the 3rd night, November the 2nd, Sarah woke to the sound of sobbing. A woman's voice, muffled and broken, coming from the living room. She crept downstairs. The room was empty, but the camera had captured audio. A woman crying, repeating, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry." It wasn't Sarah's voice. Lena reviewed the recording. "That's Evelyn," she said quietly. "She's still here too." The realization that 2 spirits haunted the house changed everything. Thomas had been found, but Evelyn, whether out of guilt, attachment, or punishment, remained. Lena explained that hauntings involving both victim and perpetrator were rare, but not unheard of. They're bound by what happened. Thomas couldn't leave because his death was hidden. Evelyn can't leave because she's tied to him. By guilt, by the act itself, they're in a loop. Sarah asked the question that terrified her. Will they ever leave? Lena didn't lie. Not without resolution. They need closure, something that allows them to move on. That could be acknowledgement, forgiveness, or release. But it has to be genuine. Daniel was more pragmatic. How do we give closure to people who've been dead for decades? Lena suggested a mediated session, a direct communication attempt. Not to provoke, but to offer peace. On November 5th, Lena returned with Jamie and Garrett. They gathered in the living room, the heart of the activity. Lena addressed the space calmly. "Thomas, Evelyn, we know what happened. We've found Thomas. He's been laid to rest with dignity. Evelyn, we know you've carried this alone for so long. You don't have to anymore." Silence. Then the EMF reader spiked. The temperature dropped. Jamie's recorder picked up a sound. Not words, but a long, shuddering exhale. Like relief. Or release. Sarah spoke next, her voice steady despite the tears. "You don't have to stay here. Neither of you. What happened is over. You can leave now." For several minutes, nothing. Then, slowly, the temperature normalized. The EMF reading dropped to baseline. The air, which had felt heavy for weeks, lightened. The cameras recorded no more shadows, no more footsteps. The house was silent. Genuinely silent. Over the following week, the Brennans monitored the cameras obsessively. No activity. No sounds. Olive stopped staring at the attic. The couch stayed flat. The water glass was never refilled. On November 12th, Lena returned to do a final sweep. Her equipment registered nothing. "They're gone," she confirmed. "Whatever was holding them here, it's resolved." Sarah exhaled for what felt like the first time in a month. "Why do you think it worked?" Lena considered. "Because you acknowledged them. Thomas was hidden, forgotten. Evelyn lived in secret shame. You brought them into the light. Sometimes that's all a spirit needs." But one question lingered. Daniel asked it on Lena's way out. "Do you think Evelyn meant to kill him? Or was it an accident?" Lena paused at the door. "We'll never know, but I think she lived with it either way, and that was her haunting. Not the house, just hers." She left. The Brennans stood in their quiet living room, the late afternoon sun streaming through the bay window. The house felt different. Not haunted, just old, just theirs. They decided to stay, sold the footage to a paranormal documentary series, enough to cover the excavation costs and repairs. They planted a small garden in the backyard, near where Thomas's remains had been reinterred in a proper cemetery. A quiet memorial. Life returned to normal, or close enough. But sometimes, late at night, Sarah would sit in the living room and wonder if they hadn't stepped outside that October evening, if they hadn't seen the shadow, would Thomas still be buried in the basement? Would Evelyn still be crying? Some hauntings, she realized, aren't meant to scare you. They're meant to be solved. In December 2017, Detective Morris closed the case. With no living suspects and evidence only of a 60-year-old crime, there would be no prosecution. Thomas Dunn's death was officially ruled a homicide. Perpetrator unknown, but presumed to be Evelyn. The file was archived. But Morris, in a private conversation with Sarah, admitted something that stuck with her. "I've worked hundreds of cases. Most of the time, families just want answers. They want to know what happened. You gave Thomas that. In a strange way, you gave Evelyn that too." The Brennans gave several interviews, podcasts, a local news segment, the documentary crew. They were careful, measured. They emphasized the facts. The shadow, the cameras, the excavation, the remains. They avoided sensationalism. But the story spread. The house on Riverside Drive became a minor point of interest in Portland's true crime and paranormal communities. Occasionally, someone would drive by slowly, taking photos. The Brennans installed a taller fence. Sarah wrote about the experience in an essay for a regional magazine. She described it not as a ghost story, but as a tragedy that took 60 years to unfold. "We think of hauntings as something separate from us," she wrote. "But they're just unfinished stories. Thomas didn't choose to stay. Evelyn couldn't choose to leave. They were trapped by what happened, and by what no one knew. When we found him, when we spoke to them, we gave them something they'd lost. Acknowledgement. That's what ended it." Daniel was more private. He refinished the basement floor, installed better lighting, turned it into a workshop. He rarely talked about what happened, but Sarah noticed he was gentler in the house, quieter, more respectful. Once she found him standing in the living room at dusk, staring at the bay window. "You okay?" she asked. He nodded. "I was just thinking, they were here all along, for decades, and no one knew. Makes you realize how much suffering can be invisible." In 2019, the Brennans had their first child, a daughter. They debated moving, starting fresh, but ultimately stayed. The house had been cleansed, not just spiritually, but emotionally. It was theirs now, fully. They hung family photos, repainted the walls, built a swing set in the backyard. The past, while never forgotten, no longer loomed. But Sarah keeps one thing from that October, the timestamp from the camera, printed and framed. October 14th, 2017, 9:47 p.m. The moment they saw the shadow, she keeps it in her office as a reminder, not of fear, but of what's hidden, of what waits to be found, of the stories that live in walls and floorboards, silent until someone listens. Years later, a grad student researching Pacific Northwest cold cases contacted Sarah. The student had found Evelyn's obituary from 1984. It included a line Sarah had never seen. "She is survived by no one, and preceded in death by her husband, Thomas, whom she never stopped searching for." Sarah read it twice, then closed the email. Some mysteries, she realized, answer themselves if you wait long enough. The house on Riverside Drive stands quiet now, just another craftsman in a neighborhood of families and dogs and Sunday mornings. But those who know, who've heard the story, who've seen the footage, understand that every home holds more than furniture and memories. Some hold confessions, some hold graves, and some, for a brief and strange season, hold the restless echoes of people who couldn't leave until someone helped them. Sarah still walks to the mailbox on cool October evenings. Daniel still follows. They glance back at the house, lights glowing warm through the bay window. And it's just a house. Nothing more. But every now and then, Sarah swears she catches something. Not a shadow, not a sound. Just a feeling. A quiet gratitude, lingering in the walls. A thank you, spoken by no one, heard by everyone who listens.